Welcome to those of you who are here so far. My name is David Swanson. I'm campaign coordinator at Roots Action Education Fund. This is your monthly online book club. We do this the first Wednesday of every month through Roots Action Education Fund. You can see all the future book clubs and all the videos of all the past book clubs at teachinnetwork.org/book clubs. And this is being recorded. And you are encouraged strongly to put all of your questions in the chat. There's no such thing as a bad question, or if there is, I won't ask it, but I'm going to try to ask all of your questions of our guest. And we are very privileged to have with us as a guest this evening, Bruce Robbins, who is an American literary scholar, author, and academic. He is the Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York City. He is the author of several books published by academic publishers, including most recently Criticism and Politics, a polemical introduction, and Atrocity, a literary history. He lives in New York City, and his newest book, the one we're here to talk about, is called Who's Allowed to Protest? Bruce Robbins, welcome to the book club.
Thank you for having me, and welcome everybody. Thanks you for coming out to the book club. It's nice to see people come around, get together to talk about books.
So before I ask any specific questions, and as people are figuring out what questions they want to type into the chat, can you tell us some of your main ideas and motivations in this book?
Well, the easy thing to say is why I started writing it. I started writing it because after there were the Gaza encampments at Columbia in the spring of 24, which I was kind of moved by, there were some very, very nasty things said in the press about the student protesters being kind of spoiled brats, privileged, and protesting really just because they wanted to feel superior to other people. And this seemed really unfair to me, but it also pushed some buttons for my generation, which was the Vietnam War generation, when various things were said that about us when we were protesting, that, you know, we weren't really protesting what we seemed to be protesting, that we were just a bunch of spoiled rich kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, and we were, you know, fighting with our parents, and all kinds of sort of psychological, sociological things were said that kind of devalue the sorts of protests that were happening. So I suppose I felt a kind of a twinge, you know, that this was reminding me of, you know, 1968, 69, 70. You know, when I walked through the encampment and I got so moved at how the kids were living and dealing with each other. Maybe I shouldn't say kids anyway, that the students, the protesters, the unfairness of it just drove me nuts. And I started writing things down, not having any idea what I was doing other than just expressing myself. And it sort of got out of hand. It was too long to be published anywhere as an essay and too short to be published anywhere as a book. It was kind of crazy. And then I ran into some people who have an independent press, and they said, "We'll publish it." And I said, "Great, you know, okay." And they said, "Not only will we publish it, but we'll make it cheap so people might actually buy and read it." And I said, "That's even better. That's never happened to me before." So that's where I find myself.
It's a very, very strange criticism. These people are protesting a genocide, but they're privileged. What does that mean? They have time to protest a genocide? So great, they should use it, right? And they're doing it to feel superior. Isn't that admitting
Yeah.
that opposing genocide is a superior position and they're correct in protest? It's a very, very strange. Why not say the genocide is a good thing? Like, I don't get it as a criticism.
Well, I think a lot of people preferred to say, basically blame the messenger rather than saying genocide is a good thing. It was kind of hard. Well, I mean, some people did basically say genocide's fine or it's not really genocide. You know, you killed 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 women and children. they deserve it somehow. They're whatever they voted for Hamas. The 5-year-olds voted for Hamas. The 3-year-olds, the babies voted for. Anyway, I think that they felt that they were at a rhetorical disadvantage, arguing, when all the images of the devastation of Gaza were available in a new, uncurated way via social media. That is, this was not a case where people had to get all their information from TV stations and radio stations and newspapers and so on, where editors could censor. They were getting stuff straight from Gaza. And the young people in particular, they said whatever, I think they said to themselves, whatever the official line is, I can see what's going on, and I really, really don't like it. And that, put the defenders of Israel and the Israeli military at a disadvantage. It was easier to cast aspersions about, who are these kids? They're not starving. They say the people of Gaza are starving, but they're not starving. People are delivering pizza to the encampment. They're look how privileged they are having pizza delivered. It's true, pizza was delivered. But they were not living the good life, sleeping on the ground. Anyway, this is the kind of thing that got me all worked up.
But the implication is you can't protest genocide unless you're in a genocide. So you can't protest somebody being in prison unless you're in the prison with them,
Right.
unable to protest it. Like, this doesn't make any sense either
I
to me.
know it sounds crazy. One thing you could say is that it's a kind of perversion of a sort of identity politics. If you're not starving, you can't complain that other people are starving. If you're not Palestinian, you can't complain about what's being done to the. I mean, it's really nuts, right? But there's a very low, cynical view of human nature and society that it's out there, and it was getting some play.
Is the idea sort of I am a selfish, greedy sociopath who would never ever protest on behalf of somebody halfway around the world, and therefore nobody else could possibly be doing that either?
Well, funny you put it that way. From a certain point of view, the ideology of capitalism is that we're all, selfish sociopaths, and this is supposed to work out, for the good, the greater good of everyone. If we don't care about anyone else's good and we just care about ourselves. This has never been true, right? But, on some level, it certainly encourages people to think um, in terms of self-interest. That is, anybody, and this is again the privilege thing again, anybody who claims to be doing anything for the public interest is just really self-interested in some way I haven't figured out yet. But if you dig into apparent disinterestedness or altruism or any concern about the common good, you dig down far enough, what you're going to find is self-interest. That's a worldview, and it seemed to me that it really got focused on the demonstrations in the spring of 24. And again, it just pushed my buttons because in many ways it just drives me crazy.
I've always liked this response that David Hume had many years ago to say, somebody did something good, but they wanted to be recognized and praised for it. Therefore, it wasn't any good. Is the ideal protester someone who is indifferent to praise? And I mean, would they even be human? What is the acceptable protester?
That's a good question. You're asking the wrong person. There are a lot, pretty much all protesters are acceptable, bro. Maybe not January 6th, but
I don't mean in your view. I mean in the view of
right.
the
Yeah, no, I know.
critics.
You'd have to ask them, I think.
Um, but what struck me so much in the book is that this was this sort of criticism of you're an elite, you're privileged, you don't have the right to protest. It wasn't invented in recent days by Fox News. This has a long, long history that you develop in the book. Can you talk a little bit about how far back some of these weird criticisms of protest go?
Um, I wish I actually said more about that than I do. I was much more, this is because it's my lifetime, much more interested in the stuff that I've seen kind of with my own two eyes. So again, the kind of Vietnam War generation. It seems to me that the anti-elite thing has been working really, really well since like, the late 60s. I suppose, all right, to be fair, you probably remember my book better than I do. Um, it has been used by sociologists about the Communist Party. There's a tradition of saying, a lot of the people who joined the Communist Party are not the working class. They are, middle class people. Karl Marx, middle class person. Engels' father owned a factory, and so on and so forth. So I suppose it goes pretty far back. I really only come into the story like in the 60s and 70s. Um, and the thing, I'm not sure how much history you really need in order to say, look around you, folks. The Republican Party is making hay out of versions of this argument. I mean, there's a kind of very, very strong anti-elitism, kind of ideology, which is really useful, which probably helped Donald Trump get elected, and is being really useful not just in attacks on higher education, which obviously I care about because I'm in higher education, so it's personal for me, but also on all kinds of public agencies, agencies which are there for the public good. Um, you know, all the regulatory agencies, the people who test the purity of food and water and who stop airplanes from colliding with each other. Um, to the extent that these people have expertise, that they can be described as experts, that they, know things that not everybody knows, they can be kind of denounced as elites and supposedly arrogant and so on and so forth. And that argument has really helped, I think, mobilize whatever popular support is there. And I don't know, maybe there's not that much popular support anymore for closing down federal agencies, which really, however cynical you may be about the federal government, I don't know how people feel about this. The stuff that's getting closed down, a lot of it really should not be closed down. A lot of it is, very much in the public interest, it seems to me. And, there are credentials that people need in order um, to do those jobs. And to some extent, this has been, a war on science and on expertise and on credentials. Again, RFK Jr. would be a good example here.
I think, people in power go to huge lengths to persuade us all that they just don't pay any attention to protests, and yet they pay so much attention that they put all this effort into concocting these reasons why the protests aren't what they appear to be, and
Right.
I don't know what success they have. I don't know what percentage of people fall for what line. Maybe you do, but they seem to give away the game that they're very, very interested in protests.
Right. I'm not an expert in this, and uh, you should probably have somebody here who is the kind of sociological expert on protests that I'm not. But I mean, just look at Minneapolis lately. I mean, it seems to me the people of Minneapolis really did something and attention was paid. And, they kind of backed off. And I think there was a kind of inspiration from Minneapolis around the country. Again, I can't prove it. I don't have facts and figures, but the feeling that I get is that that was really, really effective. And some of what was effective about it was the sense of humor, dressing up as animals. I mean, that was wonderful. I don't know how people got the idea that that would work, frogs or turtles or whatever it was.
I
Uh,
think Portland may get the credit for some of those,
yes,
but
that's true.
Minneapolis really, I mean, the songs that came out of Minneapolis and the red Norwegian anti-Nazi hats that people are now wearing in the U.S. and think came from Minneapolis. A lot of the anti-ICE culture really grew there, I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Portland was probably first.
some at least some of the crazy things on bicycles was was
Right.
Portland. Yeah. Um, by the way, people who have been coming in, welcome, 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 and put your questions in the chat, and I will ask them of Bruce Robbins about his book, Who's Allowed to Protest. Bruce and I think, are in agreement that everybody's allowed to protest. Um, there's a group that comes to mind as you're talking called Patriotic Millionaires. And I have absolutely no use for patriotism, and I don't think there should be millionaires. And if they wanted to give away their money, they damn well could. But they put themselves forward in that framework as, we're rich and we want to be taxed. We want you to tax us. We're patriotic millionaires. Are they shooting themselves in the foot? Is that actually a bad way to present themselves, because now everybody thinks they aren't qualified to protest this
Oh
because
gosh, I hope not. It sounds like a wonderful initiative, frankly. I mean, I don't know what you think. I don't know what you people in your book club think, but I think it's crude enough so that you actually have to make a case for taxes. You have to get people to feel, and this is not a popular position, that you can't do things in the public interest for the common good unless there's a sort of a fund of money, that comes in via taxes. So people saying, look, I think taxes are a good thing, especially maybe if they're millionaires. I don't know. I'm all for it. I don't know how to make that case. Here in New York, we're very much in the middle of that kind of a conversation because taxation is going to have to go up. And it's going to have to get approved in the state capital for the programs in New York City to work. And it's I don't know what the latest news is. It was maybe being decided today. Um,
But if
the
people see that they're getting free buses and affordable housing and better parks and all those that if they see that they're getting something, that would be different from your typical US taxpayer, right? Who doesn't really know what they're getting for it.
well, okay, maybe this is going off in the wrong direction, but whose fault is it that people can't see what they're getting for it? Maybe it's like people who've got podcasts like you. I mean, I don't have that kind of platform. I mean, I, teach literature in my classroom, and it's a smaller thing than that you're involved in. But I think that's a case that really needs to be made. And I don't frankly know how to make it. The book doesn't really tell you how to make it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's something that has to happen.
The other thing I hear about protesters all the time is that they're paid protesters, and I might be myself a paid protester. I work for an organization, more than one organization, that do protests, and I wonder what the hell is wrong with that. Why is that a criticism? I mean, I think there's this notion that Olympic athletes had to be non-professional because that way only super rich people could be Olympic athletes, and
Right.
so forth. But is it a legitimate criticism to say these people are paid?
Well, first of all, they're not paid. So, let's just be clear about that. Where it gets a little bit more complicated, um, is uh, where I think this is what you're talking about. I think many of us really want meaningful work that we would get paid for and we would have benefits with. I mean, if you ask people what they really, really want, a lot of people would be willing to trade higher salaries, to give up higher salaries in order to be able to feel that what they're doing is meaningful. So meaningful work, but meaningful work that's paid. That it shouldn't, you shouldn't have to be a saint in order to, living on bread and water or crusts or whatever, in order to, do the sorts of things that we all believe in.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, the cynicism is that was directed to go back to the student protesters. People were saying they just want to get better jobs. They want to sort of elevate their moral status somehow and make themselves more attractive, which seems to me obviously untrue in
Yeah.
this that a lot of people had to actually sacrifice job possibilities because they got put on lists, they got arrested, they got expelled. They paid quite a high price uh,
Yeah.
in terms of life chances for doing what they were doing. But I want to say, but if they did want meaningful jobs, if this somehow would help, it would be great because in fact, the society would work a lot better if there were more meaningful jobs out there, which people would get paid something, not become a millionaire or billionaire, but just have a decent life and have a comfortable life.
If protesting your place of education or of employment in the case of a professor like yourself advanced your career, I mean, that would be very, very strange, but it would be wonderful. I would like to live in that world.
Yeah, I think um I'm at risk of turning incoherent here. Stop me if I get too incoherent. But one of my colleagues at Columbia was Edward Said. I don't know if that name means anything to
Sure.
to people, but the thing about him is he was an exemplary scholar, but he was also an exemplary activist. And he was an exemplary activist for Palestine at a time where it was very hard. I mean, people invaded his office and destroyed his furniture and shat on the floor, tried to get him fired. I mean, he really put up with a lot because he thought he had a responsibility, having the kind of job that he had, not just to teach his classes and write his books, but, to speak up where he saw injustice. And that has been an inspiration. And some part of me thinks he's as famous as he is because he wasn't just a professor, but he was also an activist. I mean, he was admirable as a citizen. So it's not as if, um, I don't know, his career didn't benefit in any way. He got famous in part by doing the kind of activist work that he did, but that's okay. And it's an inspiration to all of us who are not getting famous that way. But at least we can win a little bit of respect from the people we respect, a little honor that we didn't just do our jobs and we're silent when there was injustice out there in the world. We also tried to speak up. Um,
Yeah.
I, again, I'm going to sound cynical here, but so for the last couple of years at Columbia, there's a bunch of us, a lot of Jewish faculty members, but not just, who have gone very public in defense of Palestine. And, there's a certain gossip. Oh, so he's the one with the microphone for that. Yeah, yeah, he's getting to be really well known. You know, the human nature will assert itself. And, people who are too good at it are always in danger of inciting jealousy and resentment just because they're good at it. But so far, I haven't seen any careers made this way.
Please, everybody, put your questions in the chat and I will ask them of Bruce Robbins. Bruce, would you say Rashid Khalidi was in that same tradition at Columbia?
Absolutely. And he's a very, very admirable figure. He's retired now. And it's a small thing anyway. If people don't know his book, The 100-Year War on Palestine, I very, very strongly recommend it. Um, Small story, anecdote, maybe of no greater value, of no great value at all. I was walking my daughter's dog uh, some months ago, and as the dog and I were approaching our front step, there was a man walking in front of us, who seemed kind of frail and older than me even, and he was reading a book while walking, which is very rare in the streets of New York.
Yeah.
Um, and as the dog and I were walking faster than he was reading a book. We came up next to him. I saw he was reading Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100-Year War on Palestine. And I couldn't restrain myself. And I said, I know the author. And he looked at me and said, so do I. and it was the journalist Seymour Hersh. No, anyway, who is a fan of Halidi's also.
Right.
Um, Halidi had said that he would teach a version of his History of the Middle East course after he retired, just because there were hundreds of people who wanted to take it. And after, and this means really doing it for no money.
Yeah.
Uh, After Columbia behaved so badly toward the the demonstrators and the faculty, he said, "Okay, I'll teach it, but I won't teach it at Columbia anymore. I'll teach it downtown somewhere."
Um, hard to blame him. Well, why don't for those who aren't familiar or have forgotten the details, Bruce Robbins, can you tell us your own experience dealing with Columbia University objecting to education of its students?
Yeah, well, it's not quite that, but I certainly find their objections objectionable. So here's my story, which I've told before. As you said, I have written a book on atrocity, and I was still writing that book in the spring of 2024, and I was teaching a class, as one will when one is trying to write a book, on atrocity and literary representations of atrocity. And in January 2024, obviously, the destruction of Gaza had been ongoing for some time. When I handed the syllabus out, the last week was devoted to atrocity and Gaza. And I didn't say what we were going to read, and I didn't say which atrocity I had in mind, whether it was October 7th or October 8th, October 9th, October 10th, and so on. I just said atrocity in Gaza. And I asked the students to recommend whatever readings they thought would be good for their fellow students. And this happened. And then on April 22nd, lo and behold, there was an encampment which was protesting atrocity in Gaza outside our classroom. So I said to the class, I'm leaving out a couple of steps. Look, I think this is a historic opportunity. Your fellow students are out there protesting our subject, talking about what we're talking about today. So I would like to wander over there and have a conversation with, with people and on on the scene of those protests. I understand not everyone's going to be comfortable doing that. If anybody is not comfortable doing it, please don't come. There will be no consequences. But anybody who wants to take advantage of this opportunity, let's go. So we went and, we talked some, and charges were brought against me by two of the students who did not come. And the charges basically were that I had violated their equality, their equal right to get an education by making them feel uncomfortable about attending that one class, which was on the encampment. And Columbia obviously took this charge seriously. This is during the time when the Trump administration was telling Columbia, you're not doing enough to combat the horrible wave of anti-Semitism on campus. And I think Columbia wanted to show the Trump administration that indeed it was doing everything in its power to combat anti-Semitism on campus. And that would include me, a Jewish professor, taking my students to the encampment. So I had to lawyer up, and there was a hearing, and then time went by, and then I had another hearing again with the lawyer, and finally they found me guilty. So this is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So equality of opportunity to get an education on the basis of national identity, that is Jewish Israeli. I was guilty of that.
Um, was anyone allegedly made to feel uncomfortable in the sense of physically threatened, or were they just intellectually uncomfortable, which you would think would be the purpose of an education?
Well, you say it very well. The problem is that Columbia administration had decided to treat intellectual discomfort as if it was a physical attack. So the so-called Task Force on Anti-Semitism detailed many, many, many supposed instances of anti-Semitism on campus. And basically, none of them were anything other than, I'm feeling unsafe, I'm feeling uncomfortable, which, as you say, is kind of the point of getting an education, is to be made to feel a little uncomfortable in the presence of, thoughts and opinions that you haven't encountered before.
And
So, I
so,
mean, there was no, I mean, sorry, just to be very, very clear,
yeah,
the administration had told us faculty members that day, um, maybe better not to hold your class on campus, but at any rate, do it hybrid, so you can do it by Zoom or face to face for reasons of safety. And I was so angry at their pretending that there were reasons of safety involved at all that I did not even suggest to the students, do you maybe want to do it hybrid? Do you want to do it by Zoom? I said, I'm just going to hold class in the classroom,
yeah.
and the implication was there is no reason for you to be afraid for your safety. There are no safety concerns involved at all. I mean, in this season now, because it's Passover for the Jews these days, it's worth saying that it was in April 2024, also Passover, and there was a Passover Seder that was held in the encampment. I mean, that's how anti-Semitic the encampment was. A lot of the students there were Jewish and were, in the name of their Jewish identity, were protesting the violence in Gaza.
And in the end, as it happened, there was no endangerment of anyone's safety. No one was injured.
Um, that's true. That is, there was a moment of danger, which I was involved in, because there was an Israeli professor from the business school who had basically threatened to bring some tough guys into the encampment and provoke a confrontation. And a bunch of us were given kind of yellow vests and told, if this happens, would you stand between, them and us? And don't fight them. Let them through if they push, but make it so that they will have to push through you in order to get to us and commit whatever violence they're going to commit. So we stood there, and the administration, in its wisdom, I have to say, for once, it was wise. They didn't let them onto campus.
Wonderful. Let me ask a question from the chat and keep putting your questions in the chat and I'll keep asking them. How do we effectively disempower weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism?
That's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, as a Jew, one thing that I feel like I'm doing is speaking up as a Jew and saying, please, don't believe that there is a wave of anti-Semitism among the protesters, because it's just not true. And I have moved among them. And if there were any anti-Semitism, I would know because I have antennas and I have encountered real anti-Semitism in my life. I know it when I see it. This ain't it. Um, of course, to the extent that there obviously has been a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, real ones. I think that's because or in reaction to the Israeli violence in Gaza. There are, people who are being driven crazy and making the mistake of blaming Jews in general for stuff that, the Israeli government and the Israeli military are doing. I will just say it doesn't help the extent to which the mainstream Jewish organizations have supported that, creates much more danger of anti-Semitism in the world than would exist otherwise. But anyway, that's all I can think of in answer to that. It's maybe too big a question for me to take on.
It's a big one. Obviously, ending the wars and genocides couldn't hurt. What what do you make years later now of the encampments? Where did they go? Were they effectively shut down? What did they accomplish? Should they be brought back? What do we do now? Etc.
Yeah. Um, People have remarked that this spring has been a lot quieter than certainly the spring 2 years ago. On the Columbia campus, things are very, very tightly policed. You can't get onto the campus without a Columbia ID, and there are security officers patrolling the campus all the time, and they have cracked down really, really hard on protesters by suspending, expelling, and getting people arrested. I discovered, it was news to me, maybe it's not news to anyone else, that this private security firm that Columbia has hired is actually subcontracted from the Pinkertons, the old strike breakers. You
Yeah.
know, there's a kind of historical continuity that you have to savor,
Oh,
that when Columbia is bringing in Pinkertons to, you know,
indeed.
to deal with possible protest on the campus. I don't know. It's quite possible that there will be, before the semester ends, more demonstrations in spite of all the policing. Um, I mean, policing, maybe it actually works, uh, because people draw conclusions from what has happened to the people from 2 years ago. Some of those punishments are still being handed out now.
What was your punishment? Did you have to go and teach the written word according to the administration, or what were you sentenced to?
Yeah, this is a natural question and a disappointing one for me. If they had really come for me, if they had tried to throw me out or something, I would have felt really important. I had been doing, while the charges were pending, there were various interviews, and I was starting to feel, yeah, I'm the guy, maybe I'll be thrown to the lions. Well, they didn't throw me to the lions. They really slapped me on the wrist, which, practically speaking, from their point of view, was probably smarter because I would have made loud noises, if they had tried to do more. No, they sentenced me to 15 minutes of conversation with my dean, who is an expert on Mexican insurgent movements, and not the sort of person who was really going to give me a hard time. And then an hour and a half training with a young lawyer, who basically said, I'm just going to teach you how not to violate Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act again. And I said, the likelihood of me doing this again is very slight because, as I testified, I was teaching a course on atrocity, and the materials for that week were atrocity in Gaza, and there was an encampment a few steps away. The likelihood of that happening again is very slight.
Yeah.
But anyway, she walked me through, what not to do if I don't want to be brought up on charges again.
And no gag order, obviously. You
No
can
gag.
talk about
No.
it.
I mean,
Oh,
the Columbia administration has accepted not exactly a gag order, but supervision by the Trump administration, in a way that has the faculty up in arms. I mean, the faculty is not happy about this. Um,
yeah.
to be honest, it's more unhappy with the capitulation to the Trump administration, the surveillance by the Trump administration, than
Yeah.
it is over injustice in Gaza and Palestine. I mean, it's easier to get people to come out in protest against the, actually not capitulation, collusion with the Trump administration, because people on the Board of Trustees at Columbia already wanted Columbia to behave in many of the same ways that the Trump administration demanded. So collusion, but rather than capitulation. But anyway, the faculty is much more eager to protest that kind of thing than to protest the fact that Columbia, uh, let's say, one of the members of the Board of Trustees has also been on the Board of Trustees of Lockheed Martin. which sells a lot of the military hardware to Israel that Israel has been using in Gaza. And, the students really wanted to bring attention to that. Our
Yeah.
money should not be invested anywhere near activities like that. But the Board of Trustees is really afraid of any transparency about where the money is invested. Because once you start peeking into that, who knows what filth is going to be exposed. So I think that's one reason they were not even willing to talk to the students about divestment.
So maybe some protests yet to come over collusion with Trump and demanding divestment.
Um, I think it's very likely that there will be that kind of protest, yes, about collusion with the Trump administration. I don't know, the supposed ceasefire in Gaza, which is not really a ceasefire. It's harder to work people up over that than it was when hundreds and thousands of people were being blown up all the time in full view. I mean, I'm as upset. Well, all right, maybe not quite as upset, but quite upset to the point of certainly wanting to protest at the what's going on in the West Bank, and what has been going on in the West Bank under cover of what was happening in Gaza, because people were all looking at Gaza and they weren't looking at the grabbing of Palestinian lands and fields and trees and so on by the settlers on the West Bank,
Yeah.
with again the collusion of the Israeli army, the IDF. So yeah,
I could
I
imagine, though, some protests of the Pinkertons as well as the National Guard, who used to be just like the Pinkertons, and the ICE. There have been a lot of protests of ICE. And these very recent No Kings protests that were so big were going to be just about ICE. And it was Iran being in the news, plus a lot of agitation from within, that the organizers mentioned the existence of wars at all just before, these most recent protests. And I wonder what you think of people going, because it seems like, on the one hand, you can use these big protests to protest these wars. On the other hand, you can use these big protests to pretend that the Democrats are already on the side of opposing all the wars and be part of that charade. What do you make of the messages that come
uh,
out of these things?
I'm afraid that I make of it pretty much what you just said. Unfortunately, even, like the No Kings protest, which I'm very enthusiastic about, can be a distraction and, can make the Democratic Party feel complacent. Like, we just have to go back to what it was under the Clintons and, all will be well. And that is so not true. And I do think a lot of people know that it's not true, that there's gonna have to be a profound transformation in the Democratic Party if, anything significant is going to be different. There's no returning to the Democratic status quo, Democratic Party status quo. Chuck
Um,
Schumer was my classmate many years ago. Chuck Schumer, I mean, okay, I'm too old, but he's really too old. I mean, he's got to go.
and his buddy in the House as well, Jeffries.
Yeah, again, not one of my favorite people. But I do have, for the time being, the upper that I have a new mayor in my city,
Yeah.
uh, and an amazing supporter of Palestine from way back. Um, and if it's possible for somebody like that to get elected in New York City, then all kinds of things are possible out there.
And I think, though, the especially wonderful thing about him being elected is not just that he had a good socialist platform, but also that the campaign was all about attacking him for opposing the genocide, and he welcomed it and didn't pretend that he did. He said, "You darn right, I oppose the genocide," and it didn't work. It didn't work anymore. We had reached a point there where it wasn't going to destroy his campaign. I thought that was very, very good news.
I think it was beyond good news. I think it was almost miraculous. Experience in the past would suggest that, that would just bring somebody down. I mean, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and a supporter of of justice for Palestine. Come
Right.
on. How does somebody like that get elected? So if miracles like that are possible, and I'm sure, they're not just possible in New York, they're possible in lots of places.
It seems to me, getting back a little bit to all this criticism of elites and privileged people, that the message of a candidate like that is the elite are the people hoarding all the money. Whereas the message of, our televisions day after day is the elite are some other thing. The elite are people who eat the wrong food or speak the wrong language
Right.
or protest genocide. They've turned elite into something other than the people with all the money destroying the world, right?
Well, that is one of maybe the major argument actually I try to make in the book. Maybe it doesn't need to be made. Maybe it's obvious. It seems to me it does need to be made because people get confused, and they think if like you've got a college degree, for example, then you're like one of the Ellisons. That you're all it's all elite covers all of this, and you kind of own the world. And it's yeah, this is a very dangerous mistake. I will say something about Zoran Mamdani's campaign, which may sound controversial. I don't know. In the primaries, because the big fight really was for him to win the Democratic primary
Right.
in New York. He didn't do as well among the poorest sections of New York, in spite of his affordability platform, as he did in the actual mayoral election. I think he had a lot of support among people who are not the poorest of the poor, but who are struggling to pay rent and don't have adequate benefits. And, maybe they do have a college degree and they are seeking meaningful jobs. I mean, things like that, people like that. It's a constituency, right? I mean, it's not the proletariat exactly. And it's only because he brought those people in by the tens and hundreds of thousands that he won the primary and then could turn his attention to pushing the affordability line among the people for whom it's even more urgent than it was against the people who actually for the people who actually helped him win the primary. I don't know whether there's any practical political wisdom in that. It's just that there are a lot of people who are not the poorest of the poor who are feeling the pinch. And, they were an absolutely crucial constituency in getting Zoran Mamdani into office.
Well, it seems like there's a big chunk of data there that people will vote on behalf of other people poorer than they are, which goes to this question of how could someone possibly protest on behalf of someone who isn't them, who isn't their family, who isn't their loved one, but is just some strange human being thousands of miles away, right? People vote all the time on behalf of strangers, right?
Yes, it's true. It wasn't exactly the point I was making, but I want to make
Right.
it, and I'm taking the opportunity now to make it. So I take it that your group is a pretty strong anti-war group,
I would
right?
hope so,
I,
yes.
I would guess that. I mean, that's kind of where I come from. Because of the Vietnam War as a kind of formative experience in my youth. There were other political things happening, but I just confess that personally, the most important thing for me was the anti-war movement. And it seems to me that this class resentment line, they take it out of the closet and put it to work, in particular when people are trying to oppose a war. That is, they feel that they can get it to work. That there's something almost middle class-ish about anti-war activism that makes anti-war activism vulnerable to a kind of class resentment argument. All right, I throw that upon you, your group. If anybody wants to say anything about it, it's just a speculation. I can't prove it, but I strongly suspect it based on my experience, back then and, things that have happened since then. So does anybody want to say something about this? Or
Well, I encourage people to put their questions in the chat and to hurry up and put your questions in the chat if I'm going to ask them. But that does, I think you're right. I mean, it does seem that they do that, and it has to depend on absolute ignorance of what the federal budget looks like, right? On what we could have if all the money weren't going to the wars that should only be protested by elite college educated snobs or whatever, right?
right. No, that's an important argument that it has been made a lot and it needs to be made over and over and over again. I guess, what am I trying to say? Uh, it's not exactly disinterested, I mean, anti-war activism, but it's like peace is in the common good, right? We all benefit from resources being given to peaceful uses rather than to warlike uses. And, it's not reducible to who actually serves in the military and who actually gets bombed. That would be the very self-interested way of putting it. Um, yeah. What do I want to say about this? Uh, again, there's a Vietnam era angle on this, which may not be interesting to anybody except me. But, one of the lines that were used at the time is that, if you went to college, you could get a deferment from the draft back when there was a draft. And when the draft got abolished, the anti-war movement kind of fell apart also because it was only the people who um, it had to do with, you actually being in personal danger yourself. I think it's not good history because the US, by the time it abolished the draft, was on its way out of the Vietnam War anyway. But, to generalize, often the people who fight wars are people who are economically disadvantaged. And out of loyalty to the people who are economically disadvantaged, there are people who will support wars which don't deserve anybody's support. But it's like our men and women in harm's way, that kind of argument. And I mean, you must have faced this, more than I have. Um, when you're trying to sort of to convert people or to talk people into seeing, the evils of war, and not uh, being tricked in a way into support for war out of their fellow feeling with the people who are going to fight the wars.
Yeah, it's an ongoing struggle, and I like to try to get people to care also about that other 96% of the casualties in wars, which are the folks who live in the country that's getting bombed. But if they want to care passionately about that 3 or 4% that are the members of the U.S. military, that's good. We should care about them, but we should care about them and keep them out of this, hell on earth, not send them in out of respect for the ones who've already died or this sort of nonsense.
As we used to say, support our troops, bring them home.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I wanted to ask you, uh, because it goes to this question of elites and privileged and so forth, and I wasn't sure what I thought about it. In the book, you had this concept of the responsibility of intellectuals, that intellectuals have the responsibility to do this. And then the question I had was, well, don't we all have the responsibility to do this? But what explain to people
Well,
what that
yeah,
concept.
I don't know whether the people in your book club are still willing to hear Noam Chomsky's name. I understand that he's gotten associated with some bad stuff. I want to think he was in his 90s, really, but anyway, back in 1966, before Epstein had been born, and where there are no aspersions about connection with Epstein. And Chomsky was more than anything else an anti-war activist. He gave a talk called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, and it was to college students. And he was saying basically, this is my translation. Look, you have the privilege, and he used the word privilege, you have access to information that not everybody has access to. And you have the ability to make sentences that not everybody is as good at doing as, you've been studying this, you've been getting good at it. All those privileges that you've got through being in college, they put a responsibility on you to talk back to the government when it makes wars and it lies about them. And, I kind of buy that argument. Obviously, everybody has a right to protest, and everybody should um, use their access to information, whatever access they've got, to talk back and to expose the lies that we're being told all the time. But I do think, and maybe it's because I'm in education, that in education, we try to make people better at that. And, people who have gotten better at it, well, they have an extra responsibility. They have the confidence to go through archives or, to check sources against other sources and stuff like that. Anybody can do it. Getting an education makes you better at it, I think. And if you have been made better at it, you have a responsibility to use that skill that you've acquired.
There was once a professor up there named John Dewey who was for all things good and decent until World War I came along, and some of his students got so well educated that they explained to him what a horrible mistake he was making, which seems like a great accomplishment for students, you know.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That has a very the the disagreement between Dewey and Randolph Bourne is a very important moment for me,
Yeah,
where Randolph Bourne said, John, you are really full of shit on this one. Uh,
as
and
it was.
and he was. I mean, I have to say, at Columbia, you could get fired for speaking against the US's entry into World War One. I have to say also the president who would fire you for that was a notorious anti-Semite, who is the one who gave his name to the library where the pro-Palestinian protesters were yeah, beaten and arrested for protesting, this war. Anyway, it's a little loop of silliness. Uh,
But the students became the teachers, right? Because
yeah.
post World War I, John Dewey became a real serious peace activist.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, we were saying before this thing started that we're both in favor of people learning from their mistakes and changing their position. And thank goodness that does happen as often as it does.
Well, thank you for everything you're doing to help people in that direction. And I think this book is a great help. The book, Who's Allowed to Protest? Bruce, if people want to follow your books and your work or even get in touch with you, what can they do?
If they want to get in touch with me, I have an email, which is at Columbia University. You just look me up. They haven't thrown me out yet. So that's the easiest. They're not going to. That's the easiest way. I don't have a blog or a Substack or any of these other things for people who have more wisdom to impart to the world than I do. But I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody wants to write me at my Columbia email.
Wonderful. Well, we all need to be doing more protesting and be better prepared for what people are going to say about us. So I highly recommend spreading this book around, Who's Allowed to Protest, by our guest, Bruce Robbins. Bruce, thanks for everything you're doing and for being part of this book club.
Thanks for everything you're doing, and thanks to the book club just for showing up because, yeah, there's symbolic magic even in showing up for something like this.
Glad to hear it.
All right.
Thanks to
Good night,
everybody.
everybody.
Good night.